A person alone in a room is not actually alone anymore once the internet becomes their primary social environment, because interaction no longer requires presence, only latency. And that subtle shift changes how identity is constructed more than most people realize. And the strange part is how silence can now function as participation. By 2026, Introvert Online is no longer a personality label. It is a behavioral architecture shaped by avoidance, control of exposure, and highly selective engagement loops, where attention becomes something allocated rather than shared. What most explanations get wrong is treating introversion as simple preference for solitude. That misses the underlying mechanism: cognitive load management, social evaluation avoidance, and sensitivity to unpredictable reward and punishment cycles embedded in digital interaction. And this is where psychology starts to break down. Because online environments remove the immediate physiological cues of social pressure, but replace them with delayed, quantified feedback signals. Scene counts, typing indicators, reply latency, read receipts. Each of these becomes a micro-evaluation event processed through social anxiety circuitry, even in low-stakes interactions. But what makes this even more unusual is how control over interaction becomes the primary coping mechanism. Muting, lurking, selective replying, and asynchronous communication are not just habits, they are regulation strategies for managing uncertainty and minimizing cognitive dissonance between intention and exposure. And this detail changes everything. Because once interaction becomes optional, absence stops, meaning rejection. It becomes strategy. Lurking becomes a stable equilibrium state where information is consumed without reciprocating social risk, creating a one-sided exposure model that feels safe but slowly reshapes engagement thresholds, which leads to a far darker mechanism. Most online platforms are not neutral communication tools. They are reinforcement environments built on intermittent validation signals. For introverted users, this produces a paradox. Low-frequency interaction is paired with high-impact feedback, creating disproportionate emotional salience for rare social events. And researchers notice something unexpected. This scarcity of interaction amplifies perceived value of each message. A single reply can carry the emotional weight of dozens of offline exchanges because it bypasses gradual desensitization that normally regulates social stimulation. This is where cognitive bias begins to accumulate quietly. Social proof operates differently in low-activity profiles. Instead of broad validation, meaning is derived from small, highly specific signals. A reaction from one familiar person outweighs engagement from hundreds of strangers, because authority bias is replaced by relational proximity bias. And this shifts everything, because now attention is not distributed evenly. It is concentrated. A few interactions become disproportionately important, and the absence of interaction becomes equally meaningful, creating interpretive gaps where ambiguity is filled by self-generated narrative rather than external confirmation. But what makes this even more unusual is how asynchronous communication reshapes emotional timing. Replies arrive detached from the original emotional state, which breaks the normal feedback loop between expression and validation. That delay forces the brain to reinterpret social meaning without immediate correction, increasing internal narrative complexity. And this detail changes everything again. Because without immediate reinforcement, cognitive dissonance persists longer. A message sent into silence does not resolve quickly. It lingers in interpretation space, allowing multiple competing explanations to coexist, each reinforced by imagination rather than feedback, which leads to escalation inside the mind rather than the conversation. Meanwhile, digital platforms quietly optimize for engagement patterns that do not distinguish between social intensity levels. A highly active user and a minimally active user are both measured through interaction probability, not emotional cost, which means introverted behavior is interpreted as low engagement rather than high selectivity. And this misalignment produces structural tension, because the system rewards frequency while the user optimizes for precision. One side pushes constant presence, the other resists unnecessary exposure. The result is a negotiation between visibility and invisibility that never fully resolves. But researchers notice something even more subtle. Lurking is not absence of participation. It is a form of observational learning driven by social comparison bias, where information about group norms is absorbed without contributing visible behavior, creating asymmetric knowledge accumulation. And this is where psychology starts to bend again. Because over time, observers begin to predict group dynamics better than participants themselves. Not because of superiority, but because reduced exposure reduces emotional distortion. Distance becomes clarity, and clarity begins to feel like control. But what makes this even more unusual is how identity starts forming around selective visibility. Users curate not just what they say, but when they are seen saying it. Timing becomes a form of social signaling, where delayed responses are interpreted as intentional rather than passive. And this detail changes everything. Because now, silence is no longer neutral. It is interpretive space. It can signal disinterest, depth, detachment, or strategy depending on context, and that ambiguity allows identity to remain flexible without being fully committed to any single social frame. Which leads to a hidden feedback loop. The less someone interacts, the more meaningful each interaction becomes. The more meaningful each interaction becomes, the higher the perceived risk of interacting again. This creates a self-reinforcing threshold, where avoidance is not fear alone, but equilibrium maintenance. And this is where sunk cost behavior quietly enters. Because once someone builds a long-term passive presence accounts, communities joined, knowledge accumulated exit, becomes psychologically costly, even without active participation. Leaving would erase accumulated social mapping, even if that mapping is invisible to others. But what makes this even more unusual is how online environments reward re-entry more than consistency. Returning after silence often produces higher social impact than continuous presence, which reinforces cyclical engagement patterns instead of stable ones. And this detail changes everything again. Because now identity is no longer continuous. It becomes episodic. People appear, disappear, reappear, and each return resets social perception, allowing multiple versions of the self to coexist across time without full reconciliation. At scale, this produces a system where introversion is not absence of social behavior, but optimization of exposure under asymmetric feedback conditions that were never designed for psychological stability. And the final implication is uncomfortable. Because if visibility is optional and participation is selective, then the boundary between disengagement and identity control becomes impossible to define cleanly. Silence stops being lack of communication and becomes a form of structured presence that the system can't fully interpret but still depends on. And somewhere in that gap between being seen and choosing not to be seen, the system keeps running anyway, assuming every quiet account is just waiting to speak again when it matters, which it usually does, right before you realize you never really left. So yeah, like and subscribe before you vanish again.